very good. I was just saying another round of Mazel Tovs to Nathan and May, to your families. Our community is very much strengthened by each of you. When I sat down to prepare for this Shabbat, I was really at a loss for words. Israel has been in my mind, in my heart, but how could I ever begin to offer nuance, offer understanding or comfort to the horrific situation that is playing out? What words can we offer the community? This morning we enter the book of Bamidbar, known in English as Numbers. But when we translate it, we see the word Bamidbar actually has nothing to do with numbers. It means in the desert. And metaphorically speaking, the desert is a dangerous place. While in the wilderness, the Israelites must overcome all sorts of negative experiences. Some folks will face internal struggle. Others will clash with God. And yet more will participate in revolts against their fellow Jews. As Rabbi Matt Dreffin teaches, in the word Bamidbar lies the secret to how we enter and how we exit this desert. Bamidbar, medaber, speaking, conversation. We know the theological revolution of our ancestors was to focus on the holiness of words. No matter where they went, no matter how low they were made, they always had words to rely on. And this Parsha comes at this particular moment in time to teach us a powerful lesson about how we can survive and find a way out of our personal deserts. We enter personal deserts when we are unable to find words to acknowledge our feelings. If we cannot check in with ourselves to articulate the factors that affect our mood at any given moment, we can be slammed with frustrations, confusion, depression. And if we are unable to acknowledge our thoughts and our feelings, we can become like the Israelites, Bamidbar, lost in the desert without a guiding light. And it is with this framing and with heavy hearts that we turn our thoughts and prayers towards Israel. Like so many others, I also struggle to put into words the complex feeling brought on by the violence in the Holy Land. I believe wholeheartedly that Israel has a right to defend itself. And I also hold as a deep tenet of my Jewish faith that all people, created in the image of God, have the right to life, to freedom and peace. And I yearn for a time when both sides can know peace without it being at the expense of one another. For a call for peace is a recognition of multiple narratives existing in a single place. In this Shabbat, I really am at a loss for words. Like you, I am grieving on so many levels. And after taking punch after punch over a very challenging year, this violence is a blow that I cannot absorb. I have learned that when we are hurting, when we don't know what to say, when we are stuck Bamidbar in a desert of an incredibly complex situation, we can turn to our leaders for guidance and understanding. I would like to lift up and share a reflection about the current situation in Israel by a friend of Holy Blossom, Rabbi Michael Marmer, a Jerusalemite, a rabbi, and the former provost of the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. Rabbi Marmer writes that the Festival of Weeks, Shavuot, will be marked this year after one of the worst weeks in Israel's history. While Israel and Hamas conduct a struggle for optical supremacy, wreaking destruction on each other, a wave of civil unrest has swept the country. Jews and Arabs have been lynched in the streets. Destruction, death, despair, decline of democracy, the death of decency. Each of us living through this dreadful event finds different ways of coping. Some switch channels in search of more edifying fare. Some adopt a simple doctrinaire position, sure of who are the angels in this epic tale and who the demons. And Rabbi Marmer continues that such false certainties has no place in this current moment. The sight of my fellow Jews marching through the streets of many of Israel's cities shouting death to Arabs and vengeance should not be downplayed or contextualized. Knowing that such acts have been mirrored on the Arab side with similarly lethal results only make the situation worse. This hatred, mired in grief and fear, fueled by misinformation, empowered by politicians, may be more of a threat to Israel than all of the rockets of Hamas and Hezbollah combined. Rabbi Marmer goes on to challenge us to take up the call of tikkun, of repair, saying that wherever you are, wherever your passions and commitments lie, I encourage you to find at least one project promoting repair and commit to it. So what do we do? How do we process? What do we say to our university students who are facing an onslaught of complicated and hate-filled messaging? How do we reconcile within ourselves our support for Israel and our dismay at the horrible circumstances that led us to this moment? How do we lay down our fear, or dare I say, put away hate? How can we make good on the promise, the prophetic promise, that nation shall not lift up sword against nation? We must first express a simple and plain truth. Criticizing Israeli policy is not inherently anti-Semitic. We must hold the leaders of Israel accountable for their actions. We do ourselves and Israel a disservice when we only view it through rose-colored glasses. Israel is a modern country, run by human beings, and therefore, by definition, it is not perfect. We can be pro-Israel and condemn violence to its minorities. We can be ardent Zionists and support the Palestinian right to self-autonomy. We can be critical of our homeland. In fact, it is a moral imperative that we must. And we must also hold in equal weight that a great deal of anti-Israel rhetoric is steeped in old-world anti-Semitism. International double standards, questioning Israel's right to exist or defend itself, or holding all Israelis accountable for the actions of its police, politicians, and military is inherently anti-Semitic. To the many Jews and non-Jews alike who have taken to social media to express disapproval of Israel's actions, please hear this. Simply stating that criticizing the Israeli government is not anti-Semitic does not absolve you from being anti-Semitic when you post something that is both anti-Israel and anti-Semitic. A simple recognition that it is okay to be critical of policy does not mean that every anti-Israel post is perfectly not anti-Semitic. Further, if your Jewish friends tell you something about your comment is anti-Semitic, you should treat them like any other minority telling you that you have hurt them, and then please listen. I cannot tell you how many people have reached out to me this week asking me how I can justify Israel's actions, as if I was sitting in the IDF Situation Room. The belief that every Jew is a vehicle for pro-Israel propaganda is anti-Semitic, as if we are not each individual human beings with our own complex thoughts and emotions. We must advocate for a world where Jewish people are not attacked, blamed, or murdered for what is happening in our homeland. As Jewish actor and recently turned unofficial Jewish educator, Mayim Bialik writes, "There exists in our culture a lack of understanding about Israel's existence, purpose, and history. There is also a profound misunderstanding about the motivations and operations of Hamas and others who seek Israel's downfall. Extremists do not speak for the Palestinian people. They also do not speak for all Israel or all Jews. I continue to believe that peace is possible," and she concludes that without this belief, I don't know what I would do. Let me be perfectly clear. I stand unwavering with the people of Israel, all of its people. This is a lifelong held position, only made stronger by personal experience. In 2014, when I was living in Jerusalem, I remember exactly where I was when I heard the news of the 3 young Israelis who were kidnapped. And I remember equally as painfully when Jewish extremists kidnapped a young Palestinian man and his uncle, killing them in retaliation. I remember vividly when the terror tunnels were identified and when rocket fire began. Living in Israel during Operation Protective Edge, I still live with this trauma. You only need to run to a bomb shelter for your life one time for it to have a lasting impact. I will never forget walking in the streets in Jerusalem when the Tzeva Adom alarm sounded for the first time, or the second, or the third, or the fourth. Each event is seared in my memory. One particularly beautiful day, the sound of the alarm pierced the sky. We were out for a walk near the city center, and there was no time to find shelter. So my friends and I dropped to the ground, huddled up next to concrete benches, threw our arms around each other, and simply prayed. The sound of the rocket being intercepted by Iron Dome was resounding. We looked at each other. That was loud. That must have been close. I looked up to the sky and saw that Iron Dome had intercepted the rocket directly above us. We ran for shelter as debris was falling. My life was saved by an unknown IDF soldier sitting in an Iron Dome battery somewhere near Jerusalem. Ever resolute, they are the protectors of my life and countless others from that day to today. And so when we read articles demonizing Israel for their disproportionate response, or infographics noting the unequal loss of life on the Israeli and Palestinian communities, please remember this. The fact that there are not more casualties in Israel does not mean that Hamas is not trying to kill Israeli civilians. It simply means that the IDF is preventing them from doing so at an incredible level. While we acknowledge this truth, I would be remiss if I did not also recognize the human pain and suffering happening in Gaza. Innocent families held captive by Hamas in an open-air prison are scared for their lives. I was brought to tears this week, admittedly a few times. But when reading a tweet from a Palestinian mother who simply said, "Tonight the kids are sleeping in bed with us. If we die together." How unbearably painful. The Israeli government has an obligation to keep its people safe, but how? What is the appropriate response, especially when dealing with the moral issue that our enemy is hiding behind civilian shields? What is a proportional response to thousands of rockets being fired on a civilian population? What exactly is this elusive, proportional response? How can one of the most militarily advanced nations in the world not respond with the best means necessary in our arsenal? It is not a fair fight by any means. We know, and they know, that Israel could wipe out Hamas in a matter of minutes, but does not because innocent lives would be taken in the process. I am amazed at Israel's restraint and Hamas's recklessness. As Hamas and Islamic Jihad fires rockets at the Israeli civilian population, they hide behind their own. Although it is painfully ironic, and though I fear I may get angry emails condemning this comment, I believe that in this moment, Israel is actively doing more to save Palestinian lives than Hamas is. The Palestinian people in Gaza are paying the heaviest price for the actions of Hamas and Islamic Jihad. Ultimately, these two terror groups should be held responsible for every casualty and injury caused by rocket fire in Israel and responsible for every necessary Israeli airstrike in Gaza. The IDF stated on Friday that indeed many of these terror rockets do not reach their intended targets. Of the over 2,300 rockets that have been fired, hundreds have fallen inside the Gaza Strip, destroying important infrastructure for their own people. The true face of this conflict is extremism. That is true on both sides. I condemn all of this violence and loss of life. Though there is a stark difference in the Israeli Air Force targeting rocket launch sites and terrorist headquarters, and Jewish settlers screaming racist obscenities, roaming the streets with the intent to kill. Let us be mindful of the enemy we face, whose stated charter speaks of complete annihilation of the Jewish state and of the Jewish people. In an important article published this week on Project Syndicate, Shlomo Ben Ami, a former Israeli foreign minister, writes, "In the current eruption of violence, Hamas connected all the dots needed to gain primacy in the Palestinian national movement. It positioned itself as the protector of Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa, as the spearhead of the Palestinians' national and religious struggle against the Israeli Jewish occupier, and also as the voice of the Arab minority in Israel proper. To make its case, Hamas was willing to pay a high price. Israel's punitive airstrikes on Gaza have been devastating, targeting Hamas military commanders with brutal efficiency. But Hamas knows that in the asymmetric wars of this era, a militia hidden among 2 million civilians in one of the world's most densely populated areas has practical immunity from defeat." And Ben Ami concludes, even as the violence escalates, it has become clear to both sides that the era of glorious war and victories is entirely over. It is so crucial to understand that there are no winners in this escalation, that we are all connected, that we are all created in the image of God, and we are destined to fail when we separate ourselves from our shared humanity. Rabbi Matt Dreffin encourages us. The way out of the metaphorical desert is through conversation. Out of Bimidbar, we must learn ledaber, to speak. We are a resilient people. We have tested that truth many, many times in our history. We also know that our friends in Israel, Jewish and non-Jewish alike, need our messages of solidarity and support. As the 12th century sage Yehuda Halevi says, though we are in the West at this moment, in particular, our hearts are in the East. Let us engage in conversation. Let us learn to be comfortable in our discomfort so that we can have challenging and truthful talks with friends and foes alike. Let us have the wisdom and discernment to separate genuine critique of Israel and the thinly veiled anti-Semitic rhetoric being spewed on the internet and news sources. I pray for peace and safety to return to every living, innocent soul that is caught in this conflict. I pray that the voices of rationality and decency speak louder and clearer than the voices of extremism and hate. I pray for a quiet night in the state of Israel and Gaza and the West Bank. Wishing all who celebrate Eid Mubarak and an early Chag Sameach the very literal Shabbat Shalom. Ken Yehi Ratzon.